You know, when people ask me why study Latin, my first response is arma virumque cano Troiae qui primus aboris Italiam fato profugus laviniaque venit litora. Multi letteris iactatus et alto vi superum saevae memorem Junonis obiera. That's why you study Latin. You study Latin because it's a beautiful language, because the literature that's available to us in Latin is outstanding, because it gives you a glimpse into the world of people who thought about things very differently than we did. It's an exercise in learning to think differently about the world for ourselves. You know, my second answer is odet amo quarid faciam fortasse requieres. Nescio, sed fieri sentiet excrucior, right? You know, you have the epics of Virgil, you have the poems of Catullus, you have the histories of Tacitus and Sallust. The literature in Latin is beautiful. And it's more powerful in the original language. Sure, you can read it in translation. But then you're reading it through the filters of someone who thinks the way we do. The Romans were different from us. They thought differently. They thought about the world differently. They thought about language differently. They expressed themselves differently. And to take the time to learn how the Romans thought about things, how they expressed themselves, that does something to you. It changes you as a person. It gives you a broader perspective. It develops your mind in ways that you can't do it without learning a different language. Latin especially, because the Romans thought about language differently than we do, because it's an inflected language, they structure their sentences differently, they structure their paragraphs differently. You know, doing that forces you to think about language in a much more nuanced way than you can if you only know one language. So I think there's certainly some benefit to learning Latin for what it does to you. But I think the benefit of being able to enjoy Latin literature is just sublime. I mean, it's fabulous. My third answer would probably be from Sallust, omnis homines qui sese student praestare ceteris animalibus, summa ope nitide cetne vitam silenteo transeant veluti pecora, quae natura prona atque ventrio boidientia finxit. I mean, it's good literature. If you want your SAT scores to go up, get an SAT prep book. I mean, honestly, you know, Latin will make your SAT scores go up, but there are easier ways of doing that. I think if you're trying to convince someone that they should study Latin, that's a good argument to make. Rhetorically, I think it's a good argument. But I think that the really compelling argument is Roman literature. I think the argument that it changes the way you think about things is pretty compelling too. I mean, I think that's definitely true. It changes the way you think about language. You know, studying Latin certainly put me way ahead of the curve in English. You know, in English class, when we got to the idea of a direct object, I was already familiar with it from Latin. So it's very valuable there. Two, the way Latin structures information, right? You have sort of categories of things, declensions. And then within those declensions, you have sort of subcategories. You know, you have third declension I-stems and things like that. That helps you prepare, you know, just the idea of taxonomy helps you prepare for biology, for chemistry, for physics, for science. So I think that Latin lays a lot of intellectual groundwork that pays dividends later. Strangely enough, Latin is also spectacular preparation for computer programming. Computer programming is in large part about managing different levels of abstraction all at the same time. In English, if you try and nest your clauses more than about 2 deep, it just collapses in on itself in a pile of goo, right? You know, if I say, the man whose uncle, whose brother went to the store, bought the monkey, sent the pig, which ate the apple, whose owner owned, I can't even finish that sentence, right? You can't keep track of the clauses in English. In Latin, you can nest clauses 5 or 6 deep and the sentence will hold up. Cicero is perhaps the most famous example of this. He'll write a sentence that goes on for a page. And what it is it's this very deep, very complex structure of clauses where, you know, the main verb of the sentence is the last word, you know, and the subject is the first word, and you have this giant pile of 8 subordinate clauses in between it, you know, and 2 of those subordinate clauses are subordinate to one of the other subordinate clauses. It turns out that that's what you do in computer programming. You have to manage the same sort of complexity. So what you do is you have a function that calls other functions that calls other functions. You have that same sort of stacking. And Latin, strangely enough, prepares you to think in terms of of nested structures like that. So it turned out that Latin really helped me become a computer programmer. That was surprising.